Few intellectual frauds have caused more damage to Western civilization than Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Here was a man who preached the natural goodness of children while abandoning his own 5 infants to foundling homes. Who proclaimed the nobility of primitive life while living parasitically off aristocratic patrons. Who invented the myth of the noble savage while displaying the calculating cruelty of a sophisticated predator. Yet this moral monster became the architect of modern educational theory, democratic romanticism, and revolutionary politics. How did such a thoroughly corrupt character gain such influence? The answer reveals the most dangerous tendency in Western intellectual life, our willingness to separate ideas from the character of those who propose them. Today, as progressive educators continue implementing Rousseau's theories with predictably disastrous results, we must finally confront the truth about this foundational figure. Character matters. Ideas divorced from moral foundation become weapons of destruction. Let me show you how one man's personal depravity shaped an ideology that continues poisoning minds centuries later. Chapter 1: The Making of a Monster. To understand Rousseau's lifelong war against civilization, we must begin with his formative years in Geneva. Born in 1712 to a clockmaker, he experienced early trauma when his mother died in childbirth. His father, unstable and violent, filled young Jean-Jacques with resentment against authority while failing to provide consistent discipline. This combination of maternal deprivation and paternal weakness would mark Rousseau for life, creating a personality that craved nurturing while rejecting all legitimate constraint. The Geneva of Rousseau's youth represented everything he would later attack: Protestant work ethic, commercial prosperity, and ordered liberty under law. The city's success through industry and trade contradicted his emerging belief that civilization corrupted natural goodness. Rather than recognize his own psychological damage, Rousseau projected his inner chaos onto society itself. This is the first pattern we observe in intellectual corruption, personal pathology masquerading as social theory. At 16, after a series of petty thefts and lies, Rousseau abandoned Geneva and his apprenticeship. This escape from responsibility became his life's template. He would repeatedly flee situations requiring sustained effort or moral accountability, always blaming others for his failures. In Savoy, he encountered Madame de Warens, a Catholic convert who seduced the impressionable youth. This relationship, simultaneously maternal and sexual, reinforced Rousseau's confused understanding of natural affection and proper boundaries. Under Madame de Warens' influence, Rousseau converted to Catholicism, betraying the Protestant faith of his ancestors for immediate advantage. This act of apostasy revealed his willingness to abandon principle for convenience, a trait that would characterize his entire intellectual career. He studied music, philosophy, and literature while living off his patroness's resources, developing the aristocratic tastes he would later condemn as corrupting influences. The crucial insight here is how Rousseau's character flaws became the foundation of his philosophy. His inability to sustain relationships made him idealize primitive simplicity. His parasitic lifestyle made him resent productive society. His abandonment issues made him fantasize about natural family bonds. Rather than confronting his moral failures, he constructed elaborate theories explaining why civilization itself was the problem. This is intellectual corruption in its purest form, using philosophical sophistication to justify personal inadequacy. Chapter 2: The Great Abandonment: Ideas Without Responsibility. Nothing reveals Rousseau's character more clearly than his treatment of his 5 children with Thérèse Levasseur, his longtime companion. Between 1746 and 1751, each newborn was immediately dispatched to the Foundling Hospital in Paris, a virtual death sentence in an age when such institutions had mortality rates approaching 90%. Rousseau knew this. He condemned his own offspring to probable death while simultaneously developing theories about natural education and the sanctity of childhood. The timing is crucial. Rousseau was writing his revolutionary educational treatise, Émile, while abandoning real children to institutional neglect. He preached the importance of natural affection between parents and children while systematically destroying such bonds in his own life. He proclaimed that civilization corrupted innocent youth while denying his own children any opportunity for either civilized education or natural upbringing. This wasn't mere hypocrisy, it was moral insanity elevated to philosophical principle. When confronted about these abandonments later in life, Rousseau offered characteristically self-serving justifications. He claimed poverty prevented proper child rearing, though he lived comfortably off patrons and could afford extensive travels. He argued that foundling hospitals provided better care than he could, a demonstrable lie given their mortality rates. Most revealing was his assertion that giving up his children freed him to write about education without the burden of practical responsibility. Here we see the fundamental corruption of the intellectual class, the belief that abstract theorizing justifies abandoning concrete moral duties. Rousseau convinced himself that writing about ideal education was more important than actually educating real children. He preferred to influence thousands of other people's children rather than love his own 5. This represented a completely inverted moral hierarchy, valuing ideas above persons, theory above reality, public reputation above private integrity. The tragedy extends beyond Rousseau's immediate victims. His educational theories, particularly his rejection of traditional authority and discipline, reflected his own inability to accept legitimate constraints. Having abandoned the responsibility of fatherhood, he prescribed permissive methods that weakened parental authority in countless families. His romantic notion of childhood innocence compensated for his devastating assault on actual children. His critique of civilized education masked his flight from educational responsibility. This pattern repeats throughout intellectual history. Those who abandon their immediate duties become zealous reformers of everyone else's obligations. Rousseau's case demonstrates how personal moral failure generates ideological extremism. Unable to fulfill the basic human vocation of parenthood, he convinced himself that conventional parenthood was inherently corrupting. This is how individual pathology becomes social poison. Chapter 3: The Noble Savage Delusion, Romanticizing Barbarism. Rousseau's most pernicious contribution to Western thought was his invention of the noble savage myth, the fantasy that primitive peoples lived in natural virtue before civilization corrupted them. This wasn't anthropological observation but psychological projection. Having experienced the constraints of Geneva's orderly society as oppressive, Rousseau imagined that somewhere, somewhen, humans had lived in perfect freedom and innocence. The factual foundation for this theory was non-existent. Rousseau never visited any primitive societies, never learned any non-European languages, never conducted any systematic research into prehistoric cultures. His entire conception of noble savagery came from idealized travel accounts and his own romantic imagination. He simply invented a state of nature that conveniently validated his personal resentments against civilized society. What Rousseau really created was an anti-Christian creation myth. Traditional Christianity taught that humans were created good but fell through disobedience, requiring redemption through divine grace and civilized institutions. Rousseau reversed this narrative. Humans were naturally good but fell through civilization, requiring return to primitive simplicity. This wasn't just philosophical disagreement, it was spiritual revolution disguised as anthropological theory. The Christian understanding of human nature recognized both divine image and sinful corruption, creating space for moral growth through grace, law, and education. Civilized institutions like marriage, property, and government weren't corruptions of natural goodness but necessary restraints on fallen nature and helps toward genuine flourishing. Rousseau's alternative myth denied both original sin and redemptive possibility, leaving only nostalgic fantasy about lost innocence. The practical consequences were devastating. If civilization corrupted natural goodness, Then traditional institutions required radical reconstruction or complete abolition. Marriage became artificial constraint on natural affection. Private property became theft from common inheritance. Government became oppression of natural freedom. Religion became superstitious manipulation of natural faith. Education became corruption of natural learning. Every achievement of Western civilization became evidence of decline from primitive virtue. Rousseau's noble savage wasn't a historical reality but a weapon against Christian culture. By positing an alternative Eden where humans lived in natural harmony, he provided revolutionary justification for destroying existing institutions. The myth persists today in environmentalist fantasies about pre-industrial societies, feminist myths about prehistoric matriarchies, and progressive delusions about indigenous cultures. Each iteration serves the same function, providing moral authority for attacking Western Christian civilization. The bitter irony is that Rousseau's own behavior demonstrated the necessity of civilized restraints. His abandonment of children, his parasitic lifestyle, his chronic dishonesty, his narcissistic rage against critics, all revealed exactly the kind of moral corruption that civilized institutions exist to prevent. He lived as a destructive savage while preaching the nobility of savagery. His personal chaos validated the very civilization he intellectually attacked. Chapter 4: The Intellectual's Betrayal, When Smart People Choose Evil. Rousseau's case illuminates a disturbing pattern in modern intellectual life, the systematic betrayal of proclaimed principles by their most articulate advocates. This isn't simple human weakness but ideological corruption that uses intellectual sophistication to justify moral abdication. When intelligence serves personal desire rather than truth, it becomes more dangerous than ordinary ignorance. Consider Rousseau's literary career alongside his private conduct. He wrote movingly about natural compassion while displaying calculated cruelty toward anyone who challenged him. He praised simple honesty while constructing elaborate deceptions to protect his reputation. He advocated transparent relationships while maintaining networks of manipulation and intrigue. His Confessions presented themselves as unprecedented moral transparency while systematically distorting facts to present himself as victim rather than victimizer. The pattern reveals how intellectual gifts can amplify rather than correct moral defects. Rousseau's literary talent allowed him to rationalize his abandonment of children as educational theory. His philosophical sophistication let him transform personal resentments into social criticism. His emotional power convinced readers to accept his authority on matters where his behavior proved his complete unreliability. Intelligence without character becomes a weapon against truth rather than a tool for discovering it. This betrayal extends beyond personal hypocrisy to deliberate ideological manipulation. Rousseau knew his theories contradicted observable reality. He admitted in private correspondence that primitive peoples weren't naturally virtuous, that children required firm guidance, that civilized institutions served necessary functions. Yet he continued propagating myths that served his psychological needs and political agenda. He chose useful lies over inconvenient truths. Modern academia perpetuates this corruption by separating ideas from character, treating intellectual production as autonomous from moral formation. Students learn Rousseau's theories about natural education without learning about his abandonment of children. They absorb his critique of civilization without examining his parasitic lifestyle. They accept his authority on human nature without confronting his demonstrable ignorance about actual human behavior. This creates intellectual schizophrenia that mistakes sophistication for wisdom. The result is generations of educated people who believe that holding correct opinions matters more than living correctly, that theoretical knowledge trumps practical virtue, that intellectual achievement excuses moral failure. They repeat Rousseau's fundamental error, preferring abstract idealism to concrete responsibility, distant humanity to immediate neighbors, perfect theories to imperfect realities. But character remains the foundation of reliable judgment. Those who cannot govern themselves cannot wisely advise others. Those who abandon their immediate duties cannot be trusted with distant reforms. Those who systematically deceive about their private lives cannot be believed about public truths. Rousseau's intellectual legacy proves that brilliant minds serving corrupt hearts produce sophisticated evil rather than genuine enlightenment. The antidote requires recovering the classical and Christian understanding that wisdom involves the whole person, not just the intellect. Truth-telling requires truth-living. Moral philosophy demands moral practice. Educational theory needs educational experience. We must judge thinkers not just by the cleverness of their arguments but by the integrity of their lives. Chapter 5: Revolutionary Seeds: How Personal Chaos Becomes Political Ideology. Rousseau's private disorders didn't remain private. They metastasized into political theories that would justify the bloodiest revolutions in human history. His inability to accept legitimate authority became democratic theory. His resentment against productive society became socialist economics. His abandonment of traditional morality became progressive social reform. Personal pathology transformed into political program. The mechanism was Rousseau's concept of the general will, supposedly the authentic voice of the people expressing collective wisdom. This wasn't empirical observation but psychological projection. Having rejected all external authority, parents, teachers, employers, traditional institutions, Rousseau needed alternative legitimacy for his preferences. The general will provided perfect justification. His desires became the people's true interests. His resentments became collective grievances. His revolutionary agenda became popular sovereignty. The French Revolution demonstrated where this logic leads. Robespierre explicitly acknowledged Rousseau as his intellectual father, carrying the philosopher's portrait and claiming to implement his theories. The terror that followed represented Rousseauvian principles in action: traditional institutions destroyed as corruptions of natural goodness, individual resistance suppressed as opposition to general will, mass murder justified as liberation of authentic humanity from civilized constraint. The pattern repeats in every subsequent revolution claiming popular legitimacy. Marxist revolutionaries abandoned bourgeois morality while imposing proletarian dictatorship. Nazi ideologists rejected Judeo-Christian civilization while implementing folkish nationalism. Progressive reformers attacked traditional family structures while expanding bureaucratic control. Each movement followed Rousseau's template: personal liberation from conventional morality combined with political power to reconstruct society according to ideological vision. What makes this particularly destructive is the moral inversion involved. Traditional Christianity taught that political authority derived from divine order and natural law, constraining rulers as well as subjects. Leaders were accountable to transcendent standards that limited their power and protected individual conscience. Rousseau replaced this with popular sovereignty unlimited by higher law, creating space for totalitarian democracy that could justify any atrocity as expression of collective will. The practical results validate traditional wisdom about fallen human nature. When authority becomes purely immanent, deriving from human will rather than divine order, it becomes unlimited and therefore tyrannical. When leaders claim to represent the people's authentic desires, they can suppress actual people who disagree with their interpretation. When revolution replaces tradition as the path to truth, each generation must destroy its inheritance rather than build upon it. Contemporary progressivism follows this same pattern. Activists who abandon traditional sexual morality claim authority to reconstruct gender roles throughout society. Politicians who reject constitutional constraints invoke democratic mandates to expand governmental power. Educators who despise their own civilization presume to enlighten other people's children about authentic values. Rousseau's influence continues through every movement that promises liberation through destruction of existing institutions. The historical evidence demonstrates that societies prosper through continuity, not rupture. Gradual reform within traditional frameworks produces sustainable improvement. Revolutionary transformation based on abstract theories produces chaos, suffering, and eventual reaction. England's constitutional monarchy evolved slowly toward broader participation while preserving essential institutions. France's revolutionary democracy collapsed into terror, dictatorship, and war. The difference wasn't democratic ideals but methods of change and respect for inherited wisdom. Chapter 6: Educational Catastrophe, Rousseau's War on Childhood. Perhaps nowhere has Rousseau's influence proven more destructive than in modern education. His rejection of traditional authority, his romantic view of childhood innocence, and his hostility toward structured learning created theoretical foundations for progressive pedagogy that has systematically undermined educational achievement across the Western world. Rousseau's educational philosophy reflected his personal psychology rather than observed reality. Having abandoned his own children and never successfully taught anyone anything, he nevertheless presumed to revolutionize childhood education. Émile, his fictional account of natural learning, described a boy educated without books, formal instruction, or moral discipline until adolescence. This fantasy compensated for Rousseau's abandonment of real children while providing intellectual justification for rejecting proven educational methods. The theory rested on demonstrably false assumptions about human nature. Rousseau claimed children were naturally good and would develop properly without adult guidance. He argued that curiosity alone would motivate learning without external structure or requirements. He insisted that moral instruction corrupted natural conscience rather than developing it. Every assumption contradicted centuries of educational experience and basic observation of childhood development. Traditional education understood that children required careful formation through habit, discipline, and incremental challenge. Classical curriculum introduced students systematically to humanity's accumulated wisdom through literature, history, mathematics, and sciences. Christian pedagogy recognized that moral character needed conscious cultivation through example, instruction, and correction. These methods produced literate, numerate, morally formed citizens capable of productive work and responsible self-governance. Rousseau's alternative promised easier results through natural development. Progressive educators embraced his theories because they justified abandoning demanding traditional methods. Rather than requiring students to memorize facts, master skills, and conform to standards, they could facilitate self-directed exploration and authentic expression. Rather than imposing adult wisdom on innocent children, they could liberate natural learning from civilized constraint. The results have been catastrophic. Generations of students have graduated without basic literacy, mathematical competence, historical knowledge, or scientific understanding. Achievement gaps have widened rather than narrowed. Cultural literacy has collapsed as traditional curriculum gave way to relativistic multiculturalism. Moral formation has been abandoned in favor of values clarification that assumes children can discover ethical principles without instruction. Even more destructive has been the assault on parental authority implicit in Rousseauvian theory. If traditional education corrupts natural goodness, then parents who impose structure, discipline, and moral instruction damage their children's authentic development. Progressive experts claim superior understanding of child psychology and authentic educational methods. Schools become vehicles for liberating children from backward family influences and primitive religious beliefs. This represents complete inversion of natural and divine order. Traditional wisdom recognized parents as primary educators with responsibility for their children's formation. Schools existed to supplement family instruction, not replace family authority. Teachers served parents' goals rather than pursuing independent agendas for social transformation. Educational institutions reinforced rather than undermined civilized values transmitted through family tradition. Contemporary educational crisis validates traditional understanding. Homeschooling families using classical methods consistently outperform progressive schools despite fewer resources. Charter schools emphasizing discipline and structured learning succeed where permissive public schools fail. Nations maintaining traditional educational approaches outcompete those implementing progressive reforms. The evidence overwhelmingly supports authority, structure, and systematic instruction over natural learning and child-centered pedagogy. Recovery requires rejecting Rousseauvian assumptions and returning to proven principles. Children need formation, not just facilitation. Learning requires effort, not just exploration. Moral development demands instruction, not just discovery. Parents must reclaim primary responsibility for their children's education rather than delegating authority to progressive experts implementing theories derived from a man who abandoned his own children to foundling hospitals. Chapter 7: The Enduring Poison, Rousseau's Legacy in Contemporary Culture. 2.5 centuries after Rousseau's birth, his toxic influence continues poisoning Western civilization through contemporary movements that unknowingly perpetuate his fundamental errors. Environmental extremism, progressive politics, therapeutic culture, and educational reform all bear hallmarks of Rousseauvian thinking, romanticizing primitive conditions, attacking traditional institutions, prioritizing feelings over facts, and promising liberation through destruction of existing order. Consider modern environmentalism's noble savage mythology. Climate activists portray pre-industrial societies as living in sustainable harmony with nature, ignoring evidence of environmental destruction, resource depletion, and ecological collapse in primitive cultures. They blame civilizational development for environmental problems while ignoring technology's role in environmental improvement. They advocate returning to simpler living while enjoying the benefits of modern medicine, communication, and transportation. The pattern exactly replicates Rousseau's romantic primitivism. Contemporary gender ideology follows similar logic. Progressive theorists claim that traditional sexual distinctions are artificial constructs corrupting natural human fluidity. They portray marriage and family as oppressive institutions constraining authentic self-expression. They advocate liberating children from conventional gender roles through therapeutic intervention and educational programming. Yet societies that abandon traditional sexual morality consistently experience declining birth rates, family breakdown, and cultural confusion that threatens their survival. Therapeutic culture has transformed Rousseau's educational theories into psychological practice. Mental health professionals assume that emotional problems stem from social conditioning rather than moral choices. They encourage patients to express authentic feelings rather than conform to social expectations. They treat traditional moral standards as sources of psychological damage rather than foundations of healthy development. The result is generations of people incapable of sustained relationships, productive work, or responsible citizenship. Political progressivism applies Rousseauvian revolution to contemporary governance. Activists who reject traditional constitutional constraints claim democratic mandates for radical transformation. They portray existing institutions as systematically oppressive rather than gradually improvable. They promise to create more authentic democracy by expanding governmental power over civil society. Each reform weakens the voluntary associations that traditionally mediated between individual and state. The common thread connecting these movements is Rousseau's fundamental error, believing that human problems stem from civilized institutions rather than fallen human nature. This creates perpetual revolution against inherited wisdom without realistic alternatives. Traditional marriage becomes patriarchal oppression. Constitutional government becomes systemic racism. Classical education becomes cultural imperialism. Religious faith becomes psychological manipulation. Every achievement of Western civilization becomes evidence of corruption requiring radical reconstruction. The practical results validate traditional Christian anthropology. Humans need structure, not unlimited freedom. Children require formation, not just facilitation. Societies flourish through continuity, not constant revolution. Morality depends on transcendent standards, not subjective preferences. Prosperity requires productive work, not redistributive politics. Peace emerges from mutual obligation, not individual self-expression. Recovery requires recognizing that civilized institutions represent accumulated wisdom about human flourishing rather than arbitrary constraints on natural goodness. Marriage channels sexual desire toward permanent commitment and child-rearing. Property rights encourage productive investment and voluntary exchange. Constitutional government limits arbitrary power while protecting individual liberty. Classical education transmits cultural inheritance to succeeding generations. Religious faith provides moral foundation and transcendent hope. The irony is that Rousseau's own life demonstrated the necessity of everything he attacked. His abandonment of children proved the importance of family bonds. His parasitic lifestyle validated productive work. His psychological instability showed the need for moral discipline. His intellectual corruption revealed the danger of separating ideas from character. His influence on revolutionary violence confirmed the wisdom of gradual reform within traditional frameworks. We can choose Rousseau's path of romantic rebellion against inherited wisdom, or we can choose the harder road of preserving and improving what previous generations built through sacrifice and struggle. History shows which choice leads to human flourishing and which leads to cultural suicide. Conclusion. The case of Jean-Jacques Rousseau serves as a permanent warning about the relationship between character and ideas. Here was a man whose personal corruption generated theories that justified revolutionary destruction of Western Christian civilization. His abandonment of children became educational theory. His resentment of authority became democratic ideology. His moral chaos became philosophical system. The damage continues reverberating through contemporary movements that unknowingly perpetuate his errors. Yet understanding Rousseau's true character liberates us from his intellectual tyranny. We need not accept theories from those who cannot live them. We need not embrace ideas that produce fruits opposite to their promises. Character matters. Truth matters. The accumulated wisdom of Western civilization, built on Christian foundations and tested through centuries of experience, offers better guidance than the romantic fantasies of intellectuals who abandon their most basic human obligations. Choose inherited wisdom over revolutionary theory. Choose proven principles over utopian promises. Choose the difficult path of preservation over the easy path of destruction.